Okay, we're back for another episode of the pre-war origins of the post-war order. And if you're listening to this, you won't be able to tell, but if you're watching it, you can see that I've got a map of Poland next to me, interwar Poland. And we're going to talk about Poland today for three particular reasons. The first of which is that it gives us some insight into nationalism and ethnicity and the relation of those things to politics, not in a theoretical sense, but in a practical sense, to see what happened to an ethnicity that didn't have self-determination, a nation that got that in the 20th century and basically squandered it. And that, it's a shame for them, but it gives us a good example. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So if you're Polish, cut me a break. We'll get to it. The second's going to be what's the historical significance of Poland in the geopolitical sense that I think is the most important way to look at these events. And then the third thing is going to be who's responsible for the German-Polish War that started in September 1939, turned into World War II, and ended up being the most destructive, both of treasure and human life, the most destructive conflict that we know of in history. Started more or less in September 1939 with a dispute over territory between Germany and Poland. So, and then nothing about the world that we live in today, almost nothing about the political system that we live in doesn't depend on what was going on at this time in this place. And of course, Paul Talk, long-term associate, long-term commentator and viewer on this channel, he asked the question, well, so you're doing this revisionist, dissident political historical commentary. What about Poland? What about the Germans and the Russians, or the Soviets, the Germans and the Soviets invading and gobbling up Poland in 1939? So we're going to answer him, and we're going to deal with these other things too. The first thing, Polish nationalism. Just very briefly, the history of Poland is that there was some kind of ethnogenesis in the West Slavs, of which the Poles are the most numerous, and they created a state, a kingdom, and merged with another kingdom, and that became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a very large and populous state in early modern Europe, the biggest at that time, I think, and probably the most powerful in the area that it occupied. Later to be eclipsed by Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a multi-ethnic oligarchic state. So the Poles and then the Lithuanians were the two dominant ethnic national groups in the state, and the Poles had a very curious pseudo-democratic but more like oligarchic government structure with a weak monarchy. So the nobles could overthrow any new legislation or any major decisions through a veto process. Anyone with voting power could get rid of legislation. And that's very attractive to the kind of oligarchy that we have today too, because if any of the major players don't agree, then nothing gets done. And if you know anything about politics, I'd say in the United States or Belgium or many other places, the elites don't get along, so just nothing happens in politics. Just total stagnation. And it may have been the Poles who invented this in the early modern period, or the late early modern period. The Polish state is important because it was a pivot of history in Central East European political life. It was between Russia and Germany, big enough to fight either of those other two. Well, Germany didn't really exist, but Prussia or the Austrian monarchy. Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was big enough to rumble with either of those groups or with Russia. And if my memory serves me right, the Poles actually marched to Moscow at one point, I think during the time of Troubles, somewhere about that time, So Poland, far from being the smaller and weaker country that it is today, at one point it was very large and powerful. And so the Germans, the Russians, and the Austrians teamed up, and over a period of maybe 150 years, they successively lopped off pieces of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia, I think, ended up with the lion's share of the territory, while the Prussians and the Austrians ended up splitting the rest. And it was an interesting experience for those three countries that received these Polish territories, because this was the first time that Russia got Jews in its country. I think it was Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, is that what we call him in English? Ivan the Dreadful, Ivan the Terrible. He said there will be no Jews in Russia. They're not allowed. They cause too much trouble. Well, Catherine II, Catherine the Great, I think she was in power when the partition was done and Russia absorbed all these Jews. And so that began a historical process that ended in 1918, when many of those Jews were involved in overthrowing the Romanov dynasty and instituting the Bolshevik USSR state. So Poland's also important for that reason. Not that the Poles had anything to do with that, but this is Polish territory, shall we say. Similar thing happened with the Germans and the Austrians. They inherited a lot of other ethnic groups that used to live in that multi-ethnic Polish Commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Austrians got some Jews out of it. I don't know how many, if any, that the Prussians or the later Germans got out of it. It's mostly the Austrians and the Russians who had inherited those Jews. So let's fast forward to World War I. Those three states that we're talking about that had gobbled up Poland were the ones who lost the war. Even though Russia was on the side of the Allies, it still ended up destroyed, depleted, and started losing large amounts of territory. As you know, when Kerensky and his Freemasonic friends did their coup and took the monarchy out in Russia, they continued fighting World War I. But then when the Bolsheviks did their coup on these Freemasonic people, they waited 4 or 5 months and had some squabbling back and forth, and eventually signed a very bad peace treaty for them that gave up huge amounts of imperial Russian territory. So Ukraine became semi-independent, semi-vassal state of Germany. Poland, I think, sort of similar. They set up some sort of, German client state in Poland. Finland, I think, became independent or just broke off completely. But anyhow, the Russian Civil War started and all those plans disappeared. And also, the territorial gains that Germany had gotten through that peace treaty were then overwritten by the Treaty of Versailles, or just the armistice and the unconditional surrender that Germany went with to end World War I. So the result was that the Polish state that you see here next to me came into existence, and it came into existence through the development of a Polish army by Polish nationalists like Pilsudski and a bunch of his friends, who they created a state out of nothing, basically. However, the Treaty of Versailles, and then there was about 2 or 3 years of fighting with the Ukrainians, the multiple different Ukrainian factions, the White Army, and the Bolsheviks. So it was a total free-for-all in the east, but the Poles managed to capture a bunch of territory and hold off the Bolsheviks and keep them from destroying their state. And eventually the Bolsheviks decided just to, let them be for the time being. They did invade them, I think, again maybe in 1921. So this stuff just kept going back and forth until the Russian Civil War was completely over and the new borders, solidified more or less. But the West, Britain, France, and the United States decided that Poland the kind of historical Poland that I was talking about before would be a good idea to bring back in order to do sort of what the function it had previously served in this early modern geopolitics. That if you have a strong Poland, it will serve as a barrier to keep the USSR, Soviet Union, and Bolshevism out of Central Europe, and that the more territory is moved from Germany to Poland, the weaker that Germany will be. So rather than supporting Poland for any kind of ideological reasons, such as we like democracy and we like self-determination and we think all these formerly oppressed subject people should have their own state, it's not for any of those reasons that people like whoever's behind Woodrow Wilson, like Edward Mandelhaus or Bernard Baruch or all of those finance people, none of those folks care one whit about Poland or Poles or Germans or Russians or any of that stuff. They just want, they want Germany to be weak, but the British mainly the British, want a strong state in Eastern Europe that will block Russia and weaken Germany. So to that end, Poland ends up getting all kinds of guarantees, loans, help from the West that otherwise it wouldn't have gotten, or would never even have existed in the first place, of course. So there ends up being enormous border squabbles between Germany and Poland because too much territory that wasn't entirely ethnically Polish in the West was given by these treaties and by occupations to Poland. So this is the map, of course, that you see right here next to me, but what I'm going to show you next is a demographic map that I put together based on some stuff that I found on Polish Wikipedia that is created out of the 1931 Polish census. So we'll start with the left. The blue stuff, that's the areas where the Germans were living. Most of those areas are mixed, so they're not entirely German, and they're certainly not majority Polish. The lightest color blue, I think, is about 20% German, and the darkest is, of course, 100% German. So you can see also Danzig, I've circled up there and written in gray, that's where it would be, and then German East Prussia is not pictured in here, but then that's the just landmass right up there. So this western area ended up being in Poland, but you can see there's enormous German populations there. Moving south from that, around Krakow and Warsaw, that's really the Polish heartland. All of those areas that are in pink are basically 100% Polish, maybe 90% or more. The areas to the east of that and to the north of that are in yellow, those areas are, anywhere from 40 to 60% Polish, and then a mix of a whole bunch of other stuff. So the central area and the southwestern particularly are the areas that would constitute undeniably the homeland of the Polish people, and that if they did have a state, those are the borders that you could definitely draw, and no one would dispute that, I don't think. To the southeast, it gets much more complicated because now we're in a three-way ethnic situation. The Ukrainians are, I think, the most numerous ethnic group in that area, but there are also a lot of Poles there too. And you'll see those red dots for larger cities. Those are where the Jews live. So the Jews are the urban groups, and they occupy all of those urban agglomerations, while the Ukrainians and the Poles live out in the countryside and do all the farming. There's a really good series of videos on YouTube that you can find if you look up Galician Jews or the history of the Jews in Galicia, that have been put out by a professor at Haifa University in Israel. Now, it's so philo-Semitic, as of course I'm sure it would be if you're in a university in Israel. It's so philo-Semitic and pandering to Jewish interests, it'll make your head spin. But if you just listen to it with with any kind of critical faculty, you can get quite a bit out of it. And he said in those lectures that something like 75% of the merchants in Poland were Jews, and only 5 to 10% of Jews were farmers. So let's just back up a little bit from this and talk about historical Poland. The Polish society was divided into 3 sections, as I understand it. There were the nobles, there were the Jews, and then there were the peasants. And the peasants were Polish, ethnically, and so were the nobles. But the Jews were the middle class. So there was no such thing as a Polish middle class. There were nobles, peasants, and then the Jews did all the middle stuff in between. Now, in normal societies, normal ethnically homogeneous societies, you have people of the same race and ethnicity at all levels of the society. And that's a good thing because the racial homogeneity creates some sort of social solidarity that cuts across class lines. When you have the racial and class stratification at the same time, it's going to be a much more fractured society, and it can lead to all sorts of other problems. So in this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the nobles took the position over time that they were actually of a different race or ethnic group than the peasants. And wouldn't you know, once they fall under Russian domination, suddenly Polish nationalism develops, and now they're all the same race again. So you can see how a lot of this stuff is dependent on the other interests that are in play, the economic and political interests. So anyhow, if you just moving back to the interwar period here, if you look at this area where the Ukrainians are living, you can see the social stratification based along these ethnic lines. And Poland, I think both in the Commonwealth and in this period, well, right up to this period, this is the golden age for Jews in Europe, because they were protected in Poland like they were protected nowhere else, because they were so valuable to the elite at helping the elite exploit the peasants. That was the role the Jews played, and they were perfectly happy to do it because of their peculiar religious and cultural outlook that sets up a barrier between them and everyone else. So it's okay if they exploit others because they're not part of the in-group. It's a sort of a racist, supremacist outlook, which of course is what the Jews are always saying that everyone else has. But if you read this history with an open mind, then you'll see where this kind of psychological problem comes from that they seem to exhibit all the time. Moving north from there, we have the same problem as in the south, but with a different Slavic group, the Belarusians, and then in the north, the Lithuanians. So you can see this eastern third of Poland is just different than the western two-thirds. It's a totally different social, cultural, and ethnic environment, and you have to ask yourself the question, does it really belong in the same state? Do those territories, should they be ruled from Warsaw or Krakow? How would you draw the borders from this state if someone gave you this problem? So, it's my contention that if you look at what came out of these agreements, it's not dictated by Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, but it's geopolitics and the interest of the British Empire. What else have we got to talk about here? We'll talk about the German-Polish War. So this census document, the census document that the data for this image came from, is itself a product of the same historical trajectory that led to that war that started in 1939. The Poles had 2 factions in their government. So first off, there was a Polish Republic that was started, and eventually there was a coup, and the nationalists swept the democracy aside and said, we're going to run this as a nationalistic, authoritarian state. headed by the military, and then a few political statesmen and this other kind of stuff that you always have to have. And so within that group that took power, now we're talking about the early 1930s, so from 1930 onward, there was a nationalist group, and there was what we could call, what Udo Wallendy calls, an imperialist group. And the nationalists wanted what nationalists everywhere want. They want their people to be safe, prosperous, and they want them to maintain their traditional way of life, speak their same language, follow the same religion that their grandparents and great-grandparents followed, the thing that nationalists want everywhere. Then there was an imperialist faction, and they wanted to recreate, basically, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the problem here, though, is you've already got all the Poles living in Poland, right? Except for the ones in the United States. So if you've got 90% or more of the Poles, or 95% of the Poles in the world or in Europe already living in this state, why do you need to expand? What do you need more territory for? Well, the idea was that they could become more powerful. They could exploit other groups if they can bring them into their state. So they wanted to march basically to Berlin and keep redrawing that westward border as far as they could. Now, since in the east they're already controlling some Ukrainians, they're already incorporated into their state, the idea there was to also keep marching eastward and gobble up more Ukrainian territory. These were obviously pipe dreams, but they were dangerous pipe dreams because they were widespread, or they were at least something that Polish people the normal Polish population could be convinced was something worthwhile to go along with. And this World War II issue from September 1939 is helped along by the ascendancy of the imperialist group after Pilsudski dies in 1935. He had been trying to establish a non-aggression pact, which they did actually sign that. Poland and Germany signed a 10-year non-aggression pact. That was Hitler and the nationalists in Poland. And they also wanted to have a mutual defense pact against the Soviet Union, which both of them agreed was the big threat. In order to accomplish that, they had to also settle this issue. So I'll slide this map back over here. If you look next to the white border, you'll see Poznan. Okay, so that area, Pomerania, from there basically up to Danzig. Slide this back over, all this blue stuff right here. Germany wanted that back. They lost it in the Treaty of Versailles, and this would be a way that if Poland would cede that formerly German territory back to them, if Germany would get that back, then Hitler would be able to go to his people and say, look, I returned German territory to Germany. Now we can be friends with the Poles and we can stand up to Bolshevism and this threat from the East. So this was the project that Hitler and some of the Poles were working on, but after 1935, they could make no progress on this whatsoever. And it seems to me, and we could go through a bunch of quotes talking about this, but we're not going to do that, the British were continually building up the Poles and saying, you're tough, you can stand up for yourself, and we will help you, the most important thing. And then finally in 1938 and 1939, that's what happens. I think it's in April 1939 is when the Germans finally decide that there's nothing more to gain from negotiations with the Poles, and they start drafting a plan to invade. This is very different from the history that you'll hear conventionally, because according to that, Hitler was planning to invade the entire world and conquer it from February 1933 or something like that. But according to what I read, the negotiations really broke down in April 1939, and they had from then until September to start planning on the invasion. But it wasn't guaranteed that there would be an invasion. The Polish army had also drawn up, I think, 3 or 4 plans to invade Germany. And they were planning on doing a rapid, mobile advance from the border all the way to Berlin. And they were counting on the British and the French on the western border either invading Germany or just soaking up a whole bunch of German divisions over on the western front, so that Poland would be able to come in from the east and take the capital and then force Germany to surrender and then gobble up a bunch of this disputed territory. So firmly take what they already were controlling and then get even more, several hundred more miles to the west. So that is essentially the situation in 1939, and what we know actually happened is that the British and the French left the Poles in the lurch when the Germans invaded. The British and the French didn't do anything, and the Poles were stuck fighting all of the German army that was currently mobilized, which, as I understand it, was not even very much. So that was it for Poland. And then Hitler told the British and the French, look, this is over. We've settled this issue. Let's have a ceasefire. Let's call off the war. But at that point, there was no way that the British and the French were going to have a ceasefire because, two reasons. One, the British had been trying to start, or certain people in the British government had been trying to start this war for a long time, and there's no way they were going to give up their opportunity. And two, the whole strategy of containment and balancing power in Europe was foiled by this kind of thing, especially by the German non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Now Germany was even stronger than it was before. It had gotten all this Polish territory. It had gotten Austria. It had reclaimed all of this stuff. There was no way the British could let this go. So that was why there was never any response to Hitler's attempts to negotiate a peace, because the British weren't having it. Wasn't going to happen. So now we'll backtrack briefly to the beginning where I started and say a little bit about the Polish state and the Polish nation and the Polish people. The Katyn Forest Massacre occurred when the Soviet Union invaded the eastern third of Poland, while Hitler was invading the western two-thirds. The Soviets rounded up something like minimum 4,000, I think, minimum 4,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, policemen, all these people that you need to run an independent state, to keep law and order and to do all the things a state has to do. And then the Russians executed them and threw them in mass graves. Hold on just a second. The fact that all of these guys who have to do the day-to-day job of running the military and the police work and all these other things, the fact that they end up in mass graves while the actual Polish government mostly fled the country and either died during the war or after the war, I think is a really good example of how perfidious and wretched the highest levels of the Polish elite have been throughout history. These are the same people who, without ethnic feeling, were perfectly comfortable employing foreigners to exploit their peasant populations. And the Polish, the highest levels of the Polish elite, the Polish aristocracy, are probably the third worst in European history, following only after the Americans and the British. I can't think of anybody worse than them. And if you're a Polish nationalist or if you're a Polish person, then, I would say don't be afraid of looking at this history and critiquing your own people and critiquing the people who led your ethnic group through history, because that's just one of those things that it seems like we have got to do, especially considering the influence of secret societies and various other people who are not as they seem. Let's put it that way, rather than getting too explicit about it. Because I looked into a few of the characters who were responsible for this debacle in September 1939, and the Freemasonry just keeps popping up, and they keep getting out of there before things get really bad. Meanwhile, their employees and their subordinates are all being murdered, all being shot in the back of the head by the thousand and ending up in a mass grave. And so I think that is pretty much all I have to say about Poland for this episode. The short version is the only reason that Poland was brought back into existence as an independent state was because of the geopolitical interests of the British and the French. The reason that Poland disappeared again as an independent state in 1939 is because the British and the French didn't want to die for the Poles, but they wanted the Poles to die for them. Meanwhile, Germany and Russia were too strong, and they overpowered Poland. I think that's it. Next time we will be talking about, hopefully, William Dodd, the American ambassador to Germany from 1933 to 1937, and his daughter, Martha Dodd, who fornicated her way across Europe and America and ended up as a Stalinist agent. And that was the guy who was supposed to be, her father was the guy who was supposed to be negotiating and keeping the peace in the world on behalf of FDR as the ambassador to the National Socialist State in Germany. Thank you for your time. We'll talk again.